Hello, and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I'm sitting in front of my movie corner. I have my Star Wars t-shirt on because I don't have anything James Bond. I've got my GoldenEye movie right next to me, and that means we are back doing episode 5 of our James Bond retrospective here on the channel. This has been me going through the entirety of the James Bond films, starting with Dr. No. I'm going to end with No Time to Die. And then afterwards, I'll do another video where I'm actually going to be kind of talking a little bit about some of my favorite Bond films. And because as you're watching through this, I'll be mentioning some of my favorite Bond films, but honestly, it's probably not going to be clear like which ones are my absolute favorites. So I'm going to go through and kind of discuss which ones are my absolute favorites. And then I will kind of then do sort of a future of James Bond. Like, where is it? Where is it going? All of that good stuff. That being said, let's jump back into this James Bond retrospective, where today we are talking about the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films. Pierce Brosnan was actually tapped, as we talked about in the last episode. He was actually contacted by the producers to come and play the role before Timothy Dalton. Because Timothy Dalton hadn't been chosen. It was actually Pierce Brosnan who was kind of tapped to come and play James Bond. Well, interestingly enough, he kind of said, I can't do it. And then he was doing Remington Steele at the time. That show kind of went under, got canceled. And so then he contacted them and said, hey, I'm free. And they said, well, we're sorry, we already have a guy. So Pierce Brosnan went on to do a couple of other films. One notable film that he did, which actually kind of got him noticed by the actual producers, was a film called Detonator. Now, this was done by USA Films. I actually saw this on USA Network back in the day. This actually came out in 1993. It stars Patrick Stewart and Pierce Brosnan. Now, of course, they feature Pierce Brosnan very prominently on the cover of the DVD because he played Bond. And so to sell the DVD, they were like, because, I mean, at that point, he'd already played Bond when this DVD was printed. And so, like, if you look at the interior, it's Pierce Brosnan, right? And it also stars Alexandra Paul, because it says Pierce Brosnan as James Bond in Die Another Day, and Patrick Stewart, Star Trek Nemesis. This was done in, of course, 2002 or 2003, because they're bringing up the worst Star Trek film, Star Trek Nemesis, and they're also bringing up one of the worst James Bond films, which we will get to when we get to it. And so basically this was actually based on Alistair MacLean's novel called Death Train. They changed up a lot of the plot elements, but Alistair MacLean was a very, very prolific writer, and he wrote a lot of different books. I believe he wrote the book for Where Eagles Dare, if I remember correctly. Now, I could be wrong on that. I've been wrong about that kind of stuff before. But anyway, this is an excellent film. If you have not ever seen this film, give it a watch. As I was saying before, it actually stars Alexandra Paul, who went on to play in the Baywatch series. And she was kind of then active a lot more in TV than she was in movie, or kind of like TV shows and TV movies rather than doing actual movies. And it also has Christopher Lee in it as a villain, so another connection to the James Bond series. And it also has Ted Levine, who, for a lot of people, know him as Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. But I know him from, and I'm trying to remember where it is. I believe it's I don't have it right off the top of my head. But anyway, he starred in the movie Heat as a detective alongside Al Pacino and Robert De Niro. And so, anyway, this is an excellent film. If you have not seen this film, give it a watch. It's just a really solid action film. There was a sequel made that I haven't gotten my hands on. It's a very subpar sequel. But it was made after Pierce Brosnan had become Bond. So this one was in like 93 or 94. And it's... yeah, of course they're going to throw a bunch of random things in there. But anyway, so I believe it was 93. And... And anyway, so it was a couple years before he did GoldenEye. Okay, so it's a decent film. I would definitely consider giving it a watch. So Brosnan was then approached to play James Bond, and he said yes. Now, what happened in 1991? Anybody know? Well, I touched on this on my Mission Impossible retrospective, and with the advent of Final Reckoning coming out this year, I'm actually probably going to do another updated Mission Impossible retrospective to kind of give a fresh perspective on the movie series, because I just watched through it with my girlfriend because she hadn't seen Dead Reckoning Part 1 yet, and we wanted to watch that because she hadn't seen the movies in a while. And so we watched through all of the movies, and then we watched Dead Reckoning, and now we're going to watch Final Reckoning when it comes out in the theaters. So, and that comes out in May. As of filming this is April. And so we're going to get some of that stuff out. And so basically, I'm hoping that I can do that here pretty soon, like I'm doing with the Bond series. I'm just going to sit down and kind of go through all the movies and just kind of like talk about them. And then what I'll do is I'll do a separate review of the movies when I get back from Kansas. I'll do a separate movie review of Final Reckoning. It was supposed to be Dead Reckoning Part 2, but for some odd reason they decided to drop the Dead Reckoning Part 2, and they just called it Final Reckoning. It is still a sequel to Dead Reckoning, but it is now just called Final Reckoning for some reason. Anyway, I mentioned this in my original Mission Impossible retrospective because that movie came out in 1996. What happened in 1991? The fall of the Soviet Union. Okay? Which meant that a lot of the plot lines from the original James Bond series, and to a large extent, a lot of the things that were going on in the Mission Impossible franchise, with the 88 and 89 series, with the original Mission Impossible being a lot to do with the Iron Curtain and the Soviets, that doesn't happen anymore. That's no longer a thing. So what do we do with that? Well, you get movies like Mission Impossible and GoldenEye. So, what is the MacGuffin of GoldenEye? And where did they get the name for it? Well, let's talk about that. So, GoldenEye was actually the name of the estate that Ian Fleming owned back in the 60s, where he actually wrote a lot of his novels from. Okay? So, they decided to call this GoldenEye, and they did it as an homage to Ian Fleming's estate of GoldenEye. The MacGuffin of the story is a key that has a gold crystal in the center of it that is called the titular golden eye. And basically what it does is they have two satellites in orbit. They have Misha and Petra, and these two satellites are basically nuclear-powered satellites that, when triggered by the key, create an EMP blast on the Earth somewhere if they have a large enough dish, and that can be directed somewhere, okay, to cause the satellite to basically give a gigantic EMP blast. Okay? So, in the opening, okay, we have Bond run across the top of a dam. He attaches a little cable, and he jumps off. Okay? Then he pulls out a little grapple gun, locks onto a thing, pulls himself down, and then cuts into this place, and he meets up with Sean Bean. Now, this is probably one of the first movies that I ever saw Sean Bean in. I didn't realize that I had seen Sean Bean in another movie, which I should probably get to one of these days, but he was in Patriot Games in 93, okay, with Harrison Ford, or 92. Decent movie, but here again, he dies on screen. Which is kind of one of the things where when people start looking at the whole Sean Bean meme of, oh, Sean Bean's on screen, he's going to die, that was kind of where they got that from, was, GoldenEye, and then, of course, a lot of his movie appearances afterwards, like Lord of the Rings, and some of his other movie appearances, he ends up dying, with notable exceptions for Percy Jackson and the Olympians, where he played Zeus. He doesn't die, and also The Martian, he doesn't die. So there's a couple of, there's some movies where he doesn't die, but yes, generally speaking, whenever Sean Bean's on screen, you can pretty much bet that there's about a 70-30 chance that he's gonna end up dying on screen. And so, anyway, Bond meets up with this guy named Alec Trevelyan, who is 006. Okay? And they are infiltrating this chemical weapons depot inside of this dam. Okay? And they go inside, and they do all this stuff, and they are there to blow up the place. And this one guy named Colonel Ourumov stops them. Bond gets into a shootout. Ourumov apparently kills Trevelyan, and Bond escapes and blows up the facility. Fast forward 9 years. So that would have been, if you're keeping track, this came out in 96, or 95. So 6 years before would have put that in 1989, which would have been, canonically speaking, right after would have been the mission immediately post License to Kill. Okay? Now, some people might argue that, it's kind of, they're different actors, they're different things, but they tend to acknowledge a lot of different things that go on in earlier movies, in later movies. So, honestly, it's like you can kind of say that that's what's going on. So then we see Bond traveling around in a car, and he meets up with the femme fatale of the Bond series, the femme fatale, Xenia Onatopp. This is like one of the first times that I think mainstream audiences that started liking the James Bond series really started latching onto this sort of like femme fatale thing, okay? Even though it had been done before in the Bond series, specifically like Thunderball, and also to a certain extent Mayday in View to a Kill. This was the first one where it's like it was plain to see. It was like she was there the whole entire time. And basically, this starts kind of a cat and mouse game between Bond and Xenia, where they're chasing each other in a car, and Bond's being evaluated by a psychologist, and he's kind of going around seeing a bunch of different, he's kind of, doing this thing, and they're chasing each other in Monte Carlo. in France. And there's some pretty interesting car chase sequences. I'll go back just a little bit. After Bond escapes, the title sequence is GoldenEye, sung by Tina Turner. Now, a lot of people think that that this was the first theme sung by a Westerner, or I shouldn't say Westerner, but by a non-British band. Forgetting that Tom Jones is not English, and he sang Thunderball. And that, like, and Tina Turner was kind of on a comeback trail at the time. She had done Tiny Dancer. She had done a few others in the 90s. She had kind of been on a resurgence. So, and they picked her because she was very similar to Dame Shirley Bassey. Okay, in terms of that bombastic sort of voice that she has, which can be silky, but then can also like hit real high notes. And this was also the first time that the title was done by Daniel Kleineman, who up until License to Kill had been done by Maurice Binder, pretty much from Russia with Love all the way up until License to Kill. And it features a lot more silhouettes, actual on-screen silhouettes of naked female models than the previous Bond films had. Previous Bond films tried very hard to sort of cover them up in certain ways, where this one uses a lot of harsh lighting to give you the impression of the body without showing off all of the other stuff. And it's a trend that would continue on throughout the rest of the series. So anyway, Bond has this run-in with Xenia Onatopp. Then he... because he's being evaluated by the new M, played by Judi Dench. And basically, like, the clue to that is that she tells Bond to stop the car. You know, she basically yells at him, "Stop this car at once!" And then he, basically hits the handbrake and stops the car. And he's like, "As you can see, I have no problem with female authority." And so you can kind of see there that he's starting to kind of adapt to the idea that the new M is a lady. Robert Brown decided that he didn't want to reprise the role, and so they hired Dame Judi Dench to play the role. And this is the first time that she played the role, and she would play this role all the way through Skyfall. Which, I mean, to me was an amazing thing that they kind of continued with Judi Dench, even though they were rebooting the franchise in Casino Royale, which we'll get to in the next installment. So, basically, Bond plays Baccarat with Xenia, and then he finds out that there's this admiral, a Canadian admiral, who gets impersonated, gets killed by Xenia, gets impersonated by Ourumov. You don't know that, it's implied, because he arrives in Siberia with the stolen Tiger prototype helicopter, which is EMP hardened. Gee, I wonder if it has anything to do with them stealing the GoldenEye. Probably not going to come up. Anyway, they do end up stealing the GoldenEye weapon, and they end up doing some things, and Bond is sent to St. Petersburg to follow up on a lead that they got, and while he's there, he meets up with Joe Don Baker, who is now playing Jack Wade, a CIA member, replacing Felix Leiter. And Jack Wade would sort of appear intermittently throughout the James Bond, the Pierce Brosnan Bonds. In fact, I think he only actually appears in 2 of them. And this would also mark the first time of Robbie Coltrane playing Valentin Zukovsky. And this would be his first of 2 appearances as well in the Pierce Brosnan Bond films. And as we know, Robbie Coltrane went on to play Hagrid in the Harry Potter series. And very prolific character actor, British character actor. And so anyway, Bond meets up with Zukovsky. He finds out about this guy named Yanis. And according to the thing is that he's part of like a type of Russian mafia. And he runs around on an armored bullet train. Well, not a bullet train, but like an armored train that we couldn't target them because if we hit the train, it wouldn't derail. It would just bounce off. So anyway, Bond finds out that Yanis is 006. Basically, some misadventures ensue. Bond ends up chasing Armoff through the streets in a tank, which is probably one of the most memorable 007 chases in the whole of the Bond franchise, because he's basically just like running through the streets on this tank. And there's one point where he like smashes through a statue, and he's literally like the statue is of a Pegasus with this guy with this big cutlass holding it out like this. And Bond's sitting in this thing like on this like tank, like driving along, and then it's like the guy who plays Ormov looks back and he's like drinking, he's like, go left, and it's like, because he realizes that there's like this whole, there's like a bridge up there and stuff like that. But it's like just the fact that he turns around and sees this like tank with this big old statue of a Pegasus like holding a sword out, like charging after them. It was hilarious. And so he ends up getting to the thing. Bond takes the tank down the tracks, puts it in front of the train, and basically shoots the train with a shell, jumps out of the tank, and sort of stops and derails the train with the tank. Then he goes on and like holds Alec at gunpoint. Alec and Onatop at gunpoint, and there's another gal, Isabella Skorupko, I believe is her name. She is sort of the Bond girl. She's a little bit damsel in distress at first, but she starts to kind of harden up as the movie goes along. So she's not like the Stacey Sutton character from A View to a Kill, where she is that way throughout the whole entire film. She is, really just kind of being, hey, she starts to realize that Bond is kind of set on this track, and that if she wants to survive, she's going to have to kind of do the same thing. So this... And so basically, they end up trading barbs. Bond ends up killing Armoff while Xenia and Alec get away. They fly off in a helicopter, and basically Natalia Semyonova, who's Isabella's character, traces Alan Cummings' Boris, who betrayed her, to Cuba. Okay, and then they basically escape from the train as it blows up, and so then they go to Cuba. Jack Wade meets up with them, and they fly over, and they basically get shot down by an air-to-air missile. Or surface-to-air missile. Sorry, not air-to-air. Surface-to-air missile. And then they're then accosted by Xenia, where Bond basically like shoots the helicopter, puts a little thing on her, puts a carabiner on her, shoots the helicopter, and then the helicopter falls down, and then she gets pulled into a tree and dies. And then Bond says the immortal line, "She always did enjoy a good squeeze," alluding to the fact that that's how she killed people, with her thighs. Okay, so it was kind of one of those like dry irony-laced humor moments. And then basically what ends up happening is that Bond infiltrates the facility with Natalia. They end up splitting up. Bond tries to set some charges. And then Natalia goes in and kind of screws around with the satellite, with the guidance system. And then, because Boris thinks that she's just below him, considering that she was a, quote, level 2 programmer, while he was, like, above her in terms of programming prowess. And so, it's kind of funny, because he's like, she worked on the guidance system, and then it's like, all of a sudden, like, they start hearing an alarm, and he's like, "Oh no, Retro Rocket's firing," and then she's like, "It will burn up somewhere over the Atlantic." It's like, aha. She broke your codes, and she, because, she broke your filing codes. Oh, and by the way, she ends up, destroying your satellite. Aha. And so, using an explosive grenade pen from Q, Bond ends up kind of blowing up the facility, and he and Alec kind of have a showdown, while Natalia basically like commandeers a helicopter, and then Bond drops Trevelyan to his death, and then Wade shows up, and then they get taken off on a helicopter back to a U.S. airbase at Guantanamo. All in all, GoldenEye is a good film. It's not my personal favorite Bond film of the Brosnan eras. That one's coming up in a couple films. It's okay. It's good for what it is. It's that post Cold War. We have to have somebody betray the spies. We have to have somebody doing something. It's okay for what it is. I know there's a lot of people who think it is the absolute best Bond film of all time. It's not. So, 2 years later, Pierce Brosnan will be back at it again in Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, this was kind of a strange Bond film, in that they had a theme all ready to go, but they changed it at the last minute. They decided that they wanted to do something that was more in line with the actual title. Now, it's also, the title was supposed to be Tomorrow Never Lies, but a mistype, instead of an L, they put a D, so it became Tomorrow Never Dies. Okay? And so this kind of became the first Bond film post Living Daylights that kind of had the traditional Bond like formula back. Okay? Because License to Kill kind of got away from that, and GoldenEye kind of got away from that. But this movie actually went back. And this actually is my personal record for the number of times I've ever seen a movie in a theater. I went and saw this movie 5 times in the theater. I absolutely love this film. A lot of people hated it. A lot of people just thought it was the worst film ever. And I actually thought it was a really good film. I went and saw it by myself once. I went and saw it with my mom. And then I went and saw it with my brother. And then I went back and saw it like 2 more times. because it was just so good. I was just like, wow, this is like traditional Bond. Like, we're back, baby. It was kind of like what happened with the Star Trek franchise in the movies, where you had, I mentioned this one, you had Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, which was a good Star Trek film. But then it kind of got off the rails a little bit when they went to Generations and First Contact, okay? And so a lot of fans were kind of like, and First Contact is beloved by a lot of fans. And what's funny is that I like this film a lot more than I like First Contact or Generations. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll watch those other two films. They're good films. I like this one because it's a return to Star Trek. It's a return to what made Star Trek Star Trek. You had some morality issues, you had some technobabble, you had some, different things, and it was a good film. It's the same thing with this one. A lot of Bond fans will gush about GoldenEye and how great GoldenEye is, and then they'll say, oh, Tomorrow Never Dies is the worst one. No, it's not. We'll get to the worst Brosnan film, but it's not this one. This one's a good film. Now, is the plot a little on the weaker side? Yes, because the MacGuffin is actually something that has become huge, especially here in America: misinformation. The MacGuffin is actually a satellite decoder that is bought by a techno-terrorist by the name of Henry Gupta. Henry Gupta is played by Ricky Jay, which, if anyone has ever seen this film, you will have seen him in this film. Okay? He's a magician. He's a prolific magician, or was a prolific magician. Rest in peace, Ricky Jay. He was a prolific magician, and that was kind of one of his last film roles, was The Prestige. It's actually right there. And so, actually, no, it's actually right here. But anyway, so it's basically, he did a really good job as sort of a guy who was, sort of a villain, just a true antagonist, okay? This brought back the hard-to-beat henchman in Gotts Otto's character of Stamper. Unlike Jaws, he actually spoke. I forgot to mention that in Moonraker, Jaws actually had one line. Well, here's to us. That's it. Anyway, Stamper does actually speak in this film, but he's that unstoppable henchman who can, eat punches like nobody's business and be stabbed and not feel any pain and just keep on going, and, they have to kill him using other means. So anyway, it's your typical Bond film, okay? This also marked the second film where they used BMW instead of Aston Martin. I don't know when they got the license to use the BMWs. It was sometime during the years between what had happened in License to Kill, or Living Daylights, and then they kind of, they still use the Aston Martin DB5 in sort of the opening kind of car chase sequence that Bond has, but all of the other cars that Bond uses up until Die Another Day were all BMWs. Okay. So the pre-credits sequence, funnily enough, has Bond going to a bazaar, infiltrating an arms bazaar on the Russian border, where he goes in, destroys a bunch of equipment, and steals a jet that has nuclear-tipped SB-5 torpedoes on them. And Bond escapes, and then gets accosted by a couple of guys, and then asks the Admiral where he would like his bombs delivered. And then again, talking about the music. So they had a song by K.D. Lang called Surrender. And they were going to put that out, but then they kind of pivoted at the very last. And they said, no, we want something a little different. And so they contacted Sheryl Crow, and they had her come in, and she created a brand new title sequence that was called Tomorrow Never Dies. And she came in and she sang that song. I actually have the sound. This is like, I think, no, GoldenEye was the first soundtrack I bought. This was the second soundtrack I bought. It was the first one I bought on CD, actually. Because back in the day, CDs were just becoming popular, and tapes were still being put out, and I still had a tape player up until about, like, 96 or 97. And then I finally bought a couple of CD players, and then I finally was able to get, because my brother didn't even have a CD player until, like, 91 or 92. And I believe CDs came out in, like, 89. They were a brand new format, and my brother, I remember, spent buku bucks to get his CD player that I think he still owns. But it was, like, as big as like, VCR was, or, like, bigger when it first came out. Like, it was, like, I mean, it was gigantic. It was huge. So, anyway, this was the first soundtrack that I bought on CD. And I remember listening to it. If I still have it. Like, I still listen to it every once in a while. It's a great soundtrack. And they... And so they brought in Sheryl Crow, and she sang this new song, and they moved the K.D. Lang song to the end credits. Okay? And I remember I was listening to the songs, and on the CD one time in the car with my mom, and I remember my mom saying, "Isn't this the actual song? Because it says Tomorrow Never Dies, Surrender. Like, isn't that the song?" And I said, "No, Mom." I said, "The actual song is the one that's at the beginning of the CD by Sheryl Crow called Tomorrow Never Dies." And she was like, "That's weird." And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I don't know why they changed." And it wasn't until later on that I found out that there was something that happened and they didn't like the song, or there was something about the song that they didn't like, or somebody changed something and said, "Hey, we can actually make a song that features just the lyrics of Tomorrow Never Dies." Whatever. So, who's the villain? Well, the villain is Jonathan Pryce. If anybody's watched the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, he was sort of the British governor that was in charge of all the colonies. His daughter was Keira Knightley. And you know, he was kind of he kind of enjoyed the character that Orlando Bloom played. Anyway, he plays a wealthy TV industrialist, TV newsman named Elliot Carver, okay, who is married to a woman named Paris Carver, whom Bond had a previous relationship with, okay? And you find out that this guy can topple governments with a single broadcast. And Bond is sent in to Hamburg to infiltrate the thing. Now, Paris Carver is played by none other than Terry Hatcher, okay? Who, for those that know the New Adventures of Lois and Clark, or Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, with Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher, she played Lois Lane in that TV show, okay? And it was meant to kind of be a soft reboot / continuation of the Christopher Reeve story of Superman, where, like, he and Lois were trying to settle down. Now, I know that, like, later on with the Superman Returns movie, they were trying to make that more of a direct sequel to at least Superman 2 or 3. Whereas in the New Adventures of Superman, that was a completely different. It was not necessarily a different universe, but it was definitely like almost like an alternate timeline of events. So it was almost like there was this kind of a split timeline where it's like in one timeline they had Lois and Clark, and then in the other timeline they had the Superman Returns. Now I could be wrong, but that was the way that I interpreted it, because it seemed like a lot of the stuff that had happened in the Christopher Reeve movies they reference, especially in the first season or two of the show, they reference back to some of the stuff happening. So, and I didn't watch it much beyond then because I wasn't very interested in Superman at the time. So I'd have to go back now and watch it again and kind of understand and do a lot of research. But I just know that that's how she was picked, was because she was very popular on TV at the time. I think she had also played in a couple of other shows. Anyway, so she was brought in to play the wife of Elliot Carver, to kind of act as sort of a foil for Bond. And so Bond goes into Elliot Carver's media headquarters in Hamburg, Germany, to try to infiltrate the place. He meets up with a gal named Wei Lin, played by Michelle Yeoh. Now, crazily enough, Michelle Yeoh had played in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon right before this, or right around this time, is how she got picked by the producers. Is she played in that film, and it got noticed at the Oscars, and then like the producers approached her and said, "Hey, would you mind doing this?" She was also in the Police Story Jackie Chan movies, and so yeah. In fact, I think Super Cop. If you watch the movie that was titled here as Super Cop, she's in that film. She plays opposite him, and like basically they kind of team up together and they solve a mystery in Hong Kong. And so, very good actress. Love her to death. She is an amazing, amazing actress. So, basic gist of the plot is a British frigate called the Devonshire was sunk. And a cruise missile was stolen. The British are accusing the Chinese are accusing the British. Turns out it was Elliot all along, because he wanted to start a war between China and Britain. Okay, and because it would cause his ratings to go through the roof. Right? He's manufacturing news, and then he's basically manufacturing it to the point where he's actually starting a war for ratings. Okay, and so Bond goes to Paris. Paris kind of rebuffs Bond, and then Elliot sends her to him. He finds out about some dealings. He gets the decoder, escapes from the building, ends up meeting up with Wei Lin a couple times in the meantime. One of my favorite parts of the movie is like he's just escaping through the thing, and he stops and he turns around and he hears this some machinery going on, and so he runs back over to the door, and she opens up the door and he's pointing the gun at her. He's like, looking for a news story, because she's pretending to be a news anchor, and and so yeah, and then it kind of like starts this whole chase after James Bond, and like she's walking through the plant doing all this crazy stuff, and Bond's like getting shot at, and he's just like, ooh, it's pretty funny. And then there's another part where like Bond knocks this guy off of a thing into a printing press, and and then as he's escaping, he's like, they'll print anything these days. You gotta love Bond. And so anyway, so the upshot of it is that Bond escapes, find out that Paris has been killed. by this guy named Dr. Kaufman. He turns the tables on Dr. Kaufman and kills him. Crazily enough, that was Vincent Schiavelli, who played in the Batman Returns a few years earlier in '92, I think it was. And it was, yeah, and I didn't even realize it was him. But anyway, so Bond gets out of that situation by killing Dr. Kaufman, and he gets out by basically like running around using the Bond car. You find out that it can be controlled by a touchpad on a cell phone, and then basically Bond like escapes from the car and then busts it out and then drops it into the Avis rental car, because that's kind of, they were using that as a cover for Bond. And then Bond goes to the South China Sea. He gives the encoder, the GPS encoder, back to the Americans. He meets up with Jack Wade, and they find out where the Devonshire sank. And then Bond gets captured. Bond finds out where the Devonshire is, learns that the missile's gone, runs into Wei Lin once again. They both get captured and taken into Vietnam. And in Saigon, there is a building where Bond, where they see basically like this big thing of Elliot Carver's face. And basically they escape. They learn that there's this guy named General Chang who has been working with him. And essentially what's going to happen is, you learn, is that basically the Chinese Air Force was flying out to attack the British fleet, and then basically what was going to happen is that Elliot Carver was going to send a cruise missile into Beijing. General Chang was supposed to call a meeting of the Chinese high command, basically all the leaders of China. They were going to get destroyed by this cruise missile, and then General Chang would take over the government in not a coup, but just sort of just say, hey, I'm the only leader left, guys, so I'm going to take over, and then this is what I'm going to do. And then he would end up emerging with a Nobel Peace Prize, and then basically basically Elliot Carver would have exclusive broadcast rights in China, and he would also get he would also have ratings over the coverage of the conflict of China and the British. And if that escalated into a world war, then, well, he would get, all of that stuff. Anyway, so Bond ends up finding out about this stealth boat because General Chang had given Elliot Carver some stealth material to construct the boat so that it doesn't appear on radar. And Bond and Wei Lin get on board. Wei Lin gets captured. Bond basically breaches the hull on the ship, and then they blow it up and escape after killing Carver and Stamper. Overall, an excellent, solid, just normal Bond film. It's a really good film. If you can look past the weaker parts of the plot, it's actually pretty decent. Now, we're getting into what is my actual personal favorite Bond film, 1999's The World Is Not Enough. I absolutely love this Bond film. This is one of my absolute all-time favorite Bond films. Pierce Brosnan decided that he was going to return, and they talked with him about doing some different things. Now, interestingly enough, when they were creating the video game on the Tomorrow Never Dies VHS tape, they had Desmond Llewellyn as Q, kind of like, showing, the players what they were kind of coming up with as a Bond video game. which ended up being pretty much scrapped, and then they went with a third-person shooter that was based solely on the movie. And then 2 years later, in early 2000, they came out with The World Is Not Enough video game for the N64 and the PlayStation. The PlayStation being a first-person shooter-only game, and the N64 version being much like GoldenEye on the N64, which came out a couple years earlier in 1997. GoldenEye video game being one of the first mainstream console shooters. Before Halo was Halo, there was GoldenEye, okay? And it was extremely popular. People were playing it all the time. I remember in college going up to friends' rooms and playing that game endlessly. That and Smash Brothers, like, was the two games that everybody had on the N64. And then when Perfect Dark came out, everybody had Perfect Dark. And it was those three. If you wanted party games, you were playing Smash Brothers, you were playing GoldenEye, or you were playing Perfect Dark. It was one of those three. And so I actually have the N64 World Is Not Enough, and I have the PlayStation Tomorrow Never Dies and World Is Not Enough. As seen, I showed you that I had the GoldenEye 007. I also have Agent Under Fire and Nightfire. Okay. Not my favorite games. Let's put it that way. Agent Under Fire is very rough. It's a very early twin-stick shooter. But anyway, getting back to World Is Not Enough, because we got to finish up here. I'm getting on to about an hour, and I've been talking way too long. So, basically, The World Is Not Enough. The pre-credit sequence starts with Bond in Bilbao, Spain. He goes into a Swiss banker's office. He gets a receipt. The Swiss banker, he wants to know who killed an MI6 agent who was trying to obtain a nuclear energy, an atomic energy commission report from Russia. And Bond ends up trying to interrogate the guy, but this gal throws a knife and kills the banker. Bond then escapes out the window. Later on in London, he meets up with this industrialist named Sir Robert King, who's a friend of M's, and they end up going to they end up kind of talking a little bit, and one of the clues that something is wrong is Bond is handling the money, and he kind of like rifles a stack of it and then throws it down, and you can see a little puff of dust on it. And that's to kind of show you that there's something on the money. Okay? And then basically Bond grabs some ice because M likes bourbon. And so Bond grabs some ice and puts it in a glass and then pours himself a glass of bourbon. And he sits down, and he's trying to debrief with M, and then he goes to drink, and then he sniffs it, and then he looks, and he sees that like something's reacting to the water on his hands, and he suddenly realizes that it was the money that he handled, and he's like, "King, the money!" And then he runs out, and then the building blows up, and Bond gets down there, and he looks out, and there's a woman on a boat. It's the same woman that was in the office, and she's shooting at him. And then Bond jumps in this little boat. Q runs over, stop, it isn't finished. And then Bond jumps out and onto the Thames, and thus begins one of the first chases since, I believe it was Live and Let Die, that was in a boat in the Bond franchise, which was amazing. Like, it was a fantastic chase. Bond even at one point like goes off road, like goes off water, and he's like driving through the streets with this boat because it has like jet propulsion on the back. Um, and Bond corners this gal, and then she tries to escape in this balloon, and then she ends up blowing herself up. And the title sequence was done by Garbage, the band, which is an English band that became popular in the United States and also in England. And so they were chosen to play in that, and it was done in such a way that that it was kind of interesting because when I found out about it, I have the Faculty soundtrack, and they did a song called Medication on there, which is a really good song. That whole soundtrack is dynamite. The movie was subpar, but the soundtrack is awesome. And they have... and it was kind of funny to hear Shirley Manson and some of the other band members talk about how, like, they'd never played with an orchestra before, and so when they were, like, recording the song and, like, she was putting on the headphones, and they're, like, playing their instruments and they're doing their things, and there's, like, this orchestra just playing in the background, and they said it was just so epic and just so awesome. And so... what is the MacGuffin of this story? Well, it's oil and nuclear. It's a little different. It's not your typical Bond film in that way. Now, Sophie Marceau plays a kidnap survivor of the villain, played by Robert Carlyle, who was coming off of an Oscar nomination, I believe. I know he won a BAFTA award for his role, and I can't remember what the movie was. But anyway, he was coming off of this brilliant performance, and he plays a man who was shot by the said MI6 agent, the one that died. And basically the bullet is like still like hit into his brain, but it didn't go sideways. Like, it didn't go sideways through the brain. It went, like, in and down towards the bottom of the brain. And so it's moving through the bottom parts of the brain, killing off his senses, okay? And, like, he can't touch, he can't taste, he can't feel pain, he feels no fear, he feels nothing, okay? He's a very unique Bond villain in that it doesn't matter what you do to him, he just doesn't feel pain. Like, you could punch him in the face, and he'd be like, oh, that's weird. Like, yeah, like you could break his jaw, and he'd be like, huh, that feels strange. Because he just doesn't, it's like he just doesn't feel that. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It really is. And so, so basically, what ends up happening is that, this guy kidnapped this Electra King, demanded $5 million US, or 3.03 million pounds, or 303030303 and 3 pence. Pounds, okay? Which is exactly the ransom amount at that time, dollars to pounds. Where, because Bond, like, pulls out and I saw this coming a mile away when I saw it in the theater, Bond pulls out the receipt, and he opens it up, and he types in, like, 5 million, like, he goes pounds to dollars, and he types in he types in the whole entire amount of pounds, and then hits enter, and then it says $5 million US. And I saw that coming a mile away. When I saw the number finally, again, I thought, because they kind of like linger on it a little bit in the office when Bond looks at it. It's like the camera lingers on it for like half a second before he folds it and then puts it away in his jacket pocket. So I knew that number was a little bit, like, suspect at the time. So, yeah, now it would be flipped. if somebody was demanding £5 million, it'd be like $3.03 million. I'm being facetious, of course. I don't think it's that bad, but our dollar has devalued a lot since those days, and the pound has become a lot stronger since those days. So anyway, you find out that Sir Robert King was building an oil pipeline, and Electra sought the help of Renard, the terrorist, played by Robert Carlyle, to basically usurp her father's control of the company so that she could detonate, or not detonate, but melt down a nuclear reactor in a sub to basically have people in Russia and Europe reliant on her oil and not everyone else's, and not the Russians. Okay. And so, but she plays it off as she's a victim, right? Like, and Bond kind of plays both ends from the middle because he's not sure who he can trust. He doesn't know if he can trust Electra, and he doesn't know if he can, and he definitely knows he can't trust Renard. And along the way, he meets up with Denise Richards as Dr. Christmas Jones. And Christmas Jones, this was kind of the first instance, and a lot of people kind of got on Denise Richards for that, for her portrayal, which a couple years before she had starred in Starship Troopers. Okay. As Carmen Ibanez. And basically, like, a lot of people kind of, bemoan her performance. I think she's just fine. I mean, is she an Oscar-worthy actress? No, but she's definitely, she was good at what she did. Basically, Bond meets up with her when Renard is trying to steal a nuclear warhead. They remove a locator card, and Bond kind of starts to get the sense that Electra's not who she says she is. And then basically Bond and Christmas meet up again after they escape. They meet up again in Azerbaijan when Electra attacks her own pipeline to cover the theft of the plutonium. Basically, they put the core of the nuclear bomb into the pipeline, but with only half the plutonium, which means it's not going to go nuclear. But there will be enough radiation to make it seem like the bomb, like, it'll seem like the bomb didn't go off completely, like it was a half detonation or a dirty bomb, basically. And so they will think, well, that's been dealt with, so we don't need to worry about it. And then there would be this catastrophic meltdown in the Bosphorus in Istanbul in a few days, and people would go, well, what the hell happened? So they find out that and then basically Electra kidnaps M because she's angry at both her father and M for not coming to her rescue. And so she had to seduce Renard to kind of make her plan come to fruition. And so it's kind of a half revenge, half I want to rule the world plot. At least motivation-wise from Sophie Marceau's character's point of view. And so there's definitely a different sense of, like, what's going on in this whole thing. So yeah, it's definitely a different thing. But anyway, Bond basically ends up and Robbie Coltrane comes back as Valentin Zukovsky, who's now a casino owner, and he's become very successful. And he's still complaining about free market capitalism. It's hilarious because he's died in the wool communist. His characters have died in the wool communist, not Robbie Coltrane himself. I'm a slave to the free market economy. It's hilarious. Anyway, so basically Bond learns through Zukovsky that his nephew runs a submarine, and you find out that his henchman, played by a British man named Goldie, who is like just gold encrusted from head to toe. His name is Mr. Bullion, kind of appropriate. Um, he um, Goldie ends up like keeps informing Elektra along the way what's going on with Bond and what's going on with Zukovsky. And basically they end up going to Istanbul. They end up finding out about all this stuff. Bond and Christmas get captured. Bond gets tortured. Zukovsky, whom you think is dead, comes back and ends up getting shot dead. But before he dies, he ends up taking his cane gun and shooting a cuff that Bond is cuffed in this chair. Shoots the hinge of the cuff so that Bond can remove his hand and then get out of the torture device. And then he chases Elektra up the stairs and shoots her dead, rescues M, and then jumps after Renard in the submarine. And then basically has a showdown with Renard in the reactor room, and disables the submarine, and then escapes with Christmas after shooting Renard dead in the chest with the rod, the plutonium rod that he was going to shove into the reactor. So, essentially, again, it's one of my favorite films. I loved it. It also was the last on-screen appearance of Desmond Llewellyn as Q. He tragically passed away like right around the time that the movie came out, or right after they got done with filming. I can't remember when it was, but it was in about like 2 weeks. I think it was after he filmed it. He died in a car accident, and I remember hearing the news, and I was so distraught, because he's such a great Q. He was such a great actor, and for him to die like that was just so bad. And they had on this VHS tape, they had a tribute to Desmond Llewellyn. So they kind of showed from Russia with Love all the way up through World Is Not Enough. They sort of showed a montage of his scenes as Q. Taking over for him, which I thought was the perfect Q replacement, was John Cleese from Monty Python. And he was the perfect replacement. Now, in this one, they called him R as sort of an in-joke, because he's like, if you're Q, does that make him R? So, yeah, they ended up calling him Q in the next film, which, kind of made it that much better. And so that's kind of where it was. But that leads us to probably the weakest film in the Brosnan Bonds, Die Another Day. Now, this is the exact same DVD that I've had since I've started owning the Bond franchise. Die Another Day was one of those things where in the early 2000s they were phasing out a lot of the VHS and they were going to only DVDs. And at the time, they did the same thing with Attack of the Clones. They had a VHS, but it was very limited print, and I never picked one up. I only picked up the DVD. In fact, I still own it. The DVD that I have of Episode 2 is the DVD that I bought in 2002. Same thing with this. I didn't buy the VHS tape. I just bought the DVD because I'd already bought a DVD player in 2002, and I went ahead and bought it anyway. Now, what is this? Well, this was the 40th anniversary of James Bond. And in this film, you have a lot of homages to previous Bond films. There was a lot of little nods to previous Bond scores. There was a lot of nods to previous Bond movies. And even the plot itself is an homage to Diamonds Are Forever. So, let's jump in and just rip the Band-Aid off. This movie was directed by Lee Tamahori, who would go on to direct XXX State of the Union. Now, while not a bad XXX movie, he's not a Bond director. A little bit like Mark Forster with Quantum of Solace, not a great Bond film. not a great Bond director. Because he just didn't understand pacing, and I'll get to that in a minute. So, to kind of talk a little bit about this, Pierce Brosnan originally did not want to come back, but the producers, like they did with Sean Connery, waved a whole bunch of money under his nose. Okay, and they delayed production for a year because this movie would have been out in 2001 because they were on a 2-year schedule. Because they wanted to hit 2002, which would have been the 40th anniversary of the Bond franchise. And so and because of that, then they wanted to kind of they went back into the vaults and they brought back all of the Q gadgets and they put them all into one place. They also have Rosa Kleb's shoe knife. They have the Gator from Octopussy. They have the Acrostar jet. They have the jetpack from Thunderball. They have some different things. It was absolutely hilarious. So let's jump in to what the plot is. Okay, so the teaser has Bond infiltrating North Korea. This was done a couple of different ways. They had one scene was on Pinewood Studios. They just kind of made a little beachy scene. They filmed a little bit on the North Shore of Hawaii. The actual big waves they filmed on the North Shore of Hawaii, of Oahu. For the surfing sequence, they filmed some of the woodland shots up in England to kind of double as North Korea. And they used a man named Will Yun Lee. Now, for everyone who doesn't know who he is, if you've seen this version of Red Dawn, this is the newer version with Chris Hemsworth, he actually plays the villain in this film. Will Yun Lee actually plays the sort of the head of North Korea, or the North Korean military who comes and attacks. Ironically enough, oh, by the way, here's Heat. Ironically enough, Ricky Yoon, who plays in this movie, would play a North Korean agent in this film. Olympus Has Fallen. So they would both go on to play more North Koreans, ironically enough. So anyway, and William Lee only appears in the opening sequence of this. He doesn't appear anywhere else in the film. So Bond infiltrates North Korea with a couple of guys, takes over a diamond smuggler by the name of Mr. Van Bierk, and basically infiltrates this compound of this guy, of this North Korean colonel named Tang Sung Moon, which was in and of itself a nod to the Kingsley Amis Bond novel called Colonel Sun. One of the first of many nods and homages, okay? And Bond then plants a C4 charge and uses his watch to detonate it. And basically, Ricky Yoon's character pulls out a cell phone and takes a picture of Bond and sends it to some mysterious person and gets back that it's James Bond, not the Conflict Diamond guy. Then Colonel Moon kind of exposes him and blows up his helicopter. And then, like I said, right before Bond's shot, he uses his watch to detonate the case of diamonds. And then he escapes on a hovercraft out into the demilitarized zone, which was actually right next to an airport in England, where they had explosions going off and different things happening. And so they Bond chases this guy down and then essentially knocks him over into a river and gets saved by one of those like gigantic bells. Okay, and then comes the immortal line, "Saved by the bell." Okay. Bond then Bond gets captured by the North Korean military, and thus begins the title sequence, which was actually sung by none other than Madonna, who at the time was kind of going through a little bit of a renaissance in the late 90s to early 2000s. She had come out with a couple of albums, and she was approached by the producers to do the thing. She had also acted in a couple of films. She was in Dick Tracy and A League of Their Own. So they asked her if she wanted to have a cameo in the film. She said yes, and so she ends up being the character of Verity at the Blades Club. And all throughout, there was a heavy use of CGI in this Bond film. It had been used before in title sequences, but this one was almost exclusively CGI. And then in the background of it, they showed like Bond being, knocked around and tortured by the guys. And then they had him. So after the credit sequence, they have him being. They have him sitting there, and he's like, his hands are tied behind his back, and he's got like really long hair and like a really long beard, and it's been like 18 months since his capture. Okay. And Kenneth Sang, who played in this movie, The Replacement Killers, with Chow Yun-fat and Mira Sorvino, ends up playing General Moon, who is Colonel Moon's father. Is like, taking Bond out. Bond thinks he's going to be taken out and executed, but he's taken to a bridge, and he's kind of walked across the bridge, and he's getting traded for Zhao, okay, the Ricky Yoon's character. And so he's like, your time will come, and he's like, not as soon as yours. As Bond arrives, they knock him out, they put him on a little thing, they take him off to a ship in Hong Kong Harbor, and Bond wakes up, and they kind of, take him through a little thing, and he wakes up, and M is there, and he like knocks on the little plexiglass, and he's like, you don't seem too pleased to see me. And she's like, well, if I had my way, you'd still be in North Korea. And and so basically what ends up happening is that they fed some intelligence to the prison secretly. Then some transmissions were sent that made it seem like Bond had cracked under torture and was hemorrhaging information. Bond denies this, of course, and so they traded Ricky Yoon's character Zhao for Bond to try to get him out of North Korea, because they figured that he was compromised. And basically Bond's putting two and two together. He goes, I got a call exposing me, or Moon got a call exposing me, and that same person has done so again to get Zhao out, and so I'm going after him. And basically, like, M tells Bond that he's of no use to anyone. So Bond basically goes into kind of a self-substantiation mode, I guess you could call it. It's where he kind of like centers himself and like kind of brings himself so that people think he's dead, and then basically like he wakes back up, and then he zaps the two guys he zaps the two male doctors with the paddles, and then thanks the woman for the kiss of life, and then walks out, and then jumps down into Hong Kong Harbor, swims to the shore, walks into a hotel, and then, he's like, you know, the guy's like, do you have a credit card? Any luggage, sir? And he's like, and then this one guy goes, this one guy named Chang comes up to him and is like, Mr. Bond, good to see you again. It's the whole trope of, Bond's known the world over, basically. And then essentially Bond then starts to look more normal. He's got his suit back on. He's got his shirts back on. He's shaving, and this girl shows up, and then basically Bond finds out that Chang is Chinese intelligence. Well, he knew he was Chinese intelligence for years, and he's like, I'm not here to take it back. He's like, because he's like, Hong Kong's our turf now, Bond, and he's like, I'm not here to take it back. He's like, look, I know Zhao killed 3 of your men. You get me in North Korea, I'll kill him for you because I need to find out some information from him. And he's like, I'll have to ask Beijing. He's like, do it. Now get out of here. And so he comes down the next day, and he's like, and Chang was on the phone with his superiors, and he hands him, and he goes, it seems Mr. Zhao has lost himself in Havana. If you see him, say goodbye from us. And then he's like, will do. And then so Bond goes to Havana, which was actually filmed in Cadiz, Spain. And then basically Bond goes in and talks to a guy about sleeper agents, and this is where the homage to Birds of the West Indies by James Bond, the actual book that Ian Fleming looked at and saw the name James Bond and decided to use it as his spy, comes in this scene. Bond basically takes a pair of binoculars and the book Birds of the West Indies by James Bond, and then he sort of like, holds those up to the guy and says, can I use these? And he says yes. There's a clinic that was they kind of got some of the ideas for this clinic from the funhouse of Scaramanga in Man with the Golden Gun. And basically Bond goes into this clinic. You see Jinx there, played by Halle Berry. She's an American agent. You don't know that at first. Who's there to kind of shut down the clinic, and to try to kill Zhao in the meantime. Bond wants Zhao alive because he wants to know what's going on. Well, in a sense, Bond rips a necklace from Zhao's thing, and Jinx escapes. And basically, Bond notices that they have diamonds inside. And when he takes them, the guy goes, the chemical signature shows, or the chemical content shows that these are from Sierra Leone. They're conflict diamonds. And Bond notices a little marking inside, a G and a G, kind of making a diamond. And he says, there's some kind of marking here. And he shows it to him, and he goes, let me see. And he goes, yes, that's from Gustav Graves in Iceland. He discovered diamonds there a year or so ago. And Bond goes, yet they're chemically identical to conflict diamonds. How very interesting. So Bond starts researching about Graves. Funnily enough, the stewardess on the plane when Bond is going back to London is Roger Moore's daughter. So that was kind of a neat little nod, similar to in this version of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. This is the American version with Rooney Mara and Daniel Craig. They had Michael Nyqvist's daughter. Michael Nyqvist was played in this version, played Mikael Blomkvist in this version of The Girl with the... This is the Swedish version of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo with Noomi Rapace. And his daughter was like working at a local coffee shop, or local cafe. And so when right after the trial, when Daniel Craig's Mikael Blomkvist goes to this place to like get a sandwich and a coffee, to kind of read over the judgment and to kind of do some different things, he, like, the woman that serves him that stuff, the sandwich and the coffee, is Michael Nyqvist's daughter. So similar to that, that's what they did in this one, is that they showed that off, and they were kind of doing that, which I thought was pretty cool. Okay, so back to this. So then Toby Stevens, who is actually Dame Maggie Smith's son, plays Gustav Graves, okay, whom you find out later is Colonel Moon in disguise, through this gene therapy clinic. Okay. Oh, and Zhao escapes, by the way. And in the meantime, Bond, finds those diamonds. So Bond goes back because Gustav Graves is going to be knighted by the Queen. Okay. He ends up going to a club. He sees a girl there, played by Rosamund Pike. This was her first kind of mainstream Hollywood role. Her second mainstream Hollywood role would be this. That's right. The 2005 version of Doom. She played Samantha Grimm opposite Carl Urban. This was kind of her first mainstream Hollywood role, was in Die Another Day. And was kind of got her noticed by Hollywood, which is then how she went on to go get a whole bunch of other roles. She would also play in Jack Reacher, opposite Tom Cruise. And so anyway, he notices this girl who's kind of a publicist. Her name is Miranda Frost. She turns out to be an MI6 agent. And basically, Bond goes to this club called Blades. Now, that was an homage to the books, where there was an actual gentleman's club in England at the time called Blades that M was a member of, and that Bond would come and visit M on occasion, the most famous example being Moonraker, the original novel, where Bond goes and has dinner with M and then goes and plays bridge, where Hugo Drax was basically dealing out the cards with his real shiny cigarette case sitting in front of him so that he could see the cards as he was dealing them. Okay, it was called a shiner. So he knew pretty much what everybody had. He had a pretty good memory, so he could remember all of the cards that were being dealt out. And then, of course, when he picked up his hand, he knew what he had, he knew what his partner had, and he knew what his opponents had. So he knew exactly what to bid, and exactly when to bid, and exactly what to do. And so, basically, Bond essentially cheats by basically taking two decks of cards, a red-backed and a blue-backed deck of cards, and then he ends up dealing what's known as a Yarborough. Okay, a Yarborough is the perfect hand in bridge. It means that all of the trick-taking cards are in your partner's hand, and all of the really good cards are in your opponent's hands, and they can't take a trick at all. Okay? They will never take a trick, because all of the good cards are in your hands. Okay? And so essentially what Bond does is he tells M, he says, "When you see me pull my handkerchief out of my pocket, I'm about to deal you a Yarborough, and we're going to take this guy for a bunch of money." Okay? But that's essentially where they got the Blades name from, for this club. Now, it's a fencing club, okay? Because Miranda Frost was a fencer, she'd won a gold medal, she'd, done all this stuff, and then Gustav Graves was also a fencer, and this is where Verity comes in, the character that Madonna plays. And essentially, Bond and Graves do a Goldfinger thing where basically Bond says, "Let's play for this." And she's like, "I believe it's one of yours." And Gustav Graves looks at it and he goes, "Flawless specimen." And then he's like, "I believe it's one." And then he's like, "Oh, you're about to lose something precious." And so then they start fighting, and Bond slashes his wrist to get him angry. And then he's like, "First blood drawn from the torso." And then they throw a cutlass at him, and then they start fighting. And then they have a big sword fight all throughout the club. And then at the end, Bond gets a check for the money, just like in that one, and and um, Bond gets invited to Iceland to see this thing that Graves is doing. Bond then goes to a subway station that is used to kind of talk to agents who may not be above board anymore. They may not necessarily be. They're still considered agents, but they're not active agents. As Bond puts it, abandoned station for abandoned agents. And then basically, like, you know, and this is kind of where M's sort of, apologies or unprofessional, regret his unprofessional kind of demeanor comes into play, is in this film. It'll come back in the Daniel Craig films. But it was kind of established in this one because Bond is like, you burned me, now you want my help. And she's like, what do you expect, a bloody apology? And so Bond is essentially trying to... So Bond suspects that Gustav Graves is laundering conflict diamonds, African conflict diamonds. So what he's doing is he's receiving shipments of conflict diamonds in secret, engraving his laser signature into them, and then selling them on the market and making back the money. Okay? And so... and so essentially... And then that's when you also find out that Miranda Frost is an MI6 agent. So Bond goes to Iceland, meets up with Jinx again, and they end up kind of playing both ends from the middle, essentially. Bond and Jinx, and they're kind of like doing some different things. They end up kind of becoming partners towards the third act. But in this second act here, where they're in Iceland, they're kind of still apart. They haven't quite gotten together yet. Until Bond essentially goes in, frees Jinx. Jinx goes back to get Miranda, but you find out Miranda Frost is the double agent. She's the one that sold out Bond. And you find out later that the Americans knew about it and shared that information with the British, which was kind of stupid. And essentially, Bond and Jinx escape. Bond kills Zhao, revives Jinx as she's kind of being slowly drowned by Gustav Graves, using this laser called Icarus. And essentially, Icarus is the satellite from Diamonds Are Forever on steroids. It's this gigantic satellite that has a big reflective thing on it that basically can reflect the sunlight back down, but it can also focus the satellite into like a laser beam. Okay? And so essentially, Bond and Jinx go to North Korea. They steal on board a plane that belongs to Graves. Graves kills his father, played by Kenneth Sang, the General Moon, okay, and starts to use Icarus to blow up the mines along the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, with the intention of, like an Octopussy, where the nuclear disarmament of the Western nations would have allowed the Soviets to just wander straight in, just waltz straight in through Europe and just capture every single country. Kind of the same thing. He wanted to unite Korea, okay? And that was how he was doing it. And that's his MacGuffin, is this gigantic space laser, okay? And so Bond ends up confronting Graves. Jinx ends up confronting Miranda Frost. And Jinx ends up sending the plane towards the Icarus laser, and then basically Bond ends up killing Graves and sending him through the plane's engine, thereby killing Icarus. And they essentially escape in a helicopter. Now there was a couple of parts that I found that were pretty cool. There was one part where right after Bond comes back to MI6, he's seen sitting in his thing, kind of cleaning his gun, and then he hears something and he pulls out a clip, shoves it into the gun, and then he starts walking around and he starts shooting a bunch of guys, and then he ends up like shooting M in the shoulder and then shooting the guy, like, and then M goes, "If by mentioning it, 007, a perfect marksman isn't really supposed to shoot his own boss." And then he like presses these little glasses and they go away, and then he pulls them off of, and you find out it's like a VR training simulation. And he goes, "Check the replay. You'll find he's dead and she's only got a flesh wound." And he's like, "There's always an excuse with you, isn't there, 000?" And then basically, like, that's when they walk into this, thing. He's like, "So this is where they keep all the old relics, eh?" And then he's like, he like pulls out the little thing, and he's like, and then it's like there's another part where he walks over to the jetpack from Thunderball, and he's like, "Does this still work?" And he pushes the button, and it starts flying up, and you see John Cleese's like trying to pull it back down. That was like one of the best moments of the film, as he's just like, he's like, "Would you stop touching everything?" He's like, "Where is this cutting edge technology? I'm trying to get to it." But a lot of people thought that, it's like at this point Bond had become too reliant on the gadgets and the technology and the various things that it sort of like kind of made some of the Bond movies getting kind of silly at this point. And I just think that this film, it's like there's a chase sequence that happens in Iceland, which was dynamite chase. I mean, it was really well handled. But you're left so breathless after that chase, and then there's still the third act of the film. There's still like 45 minutes of the film left. And you're going, "Oh, there's more? Dude, what?" And the ending is so anticlimactic compared to the chase with the death of Zhao. The death of Graves is very anticlimactic compared to that. And so I just feel like there could have been more. There should have been a better way to write the script, to have the story, to do everything without it being that way. Okay? This was also the last of Samantha Bond. And there's a scene where she's starting to, like, get together with Pierce Brosnan, and then you find out that she's wearing the same glasses that Pierce Brosnan was wearing earlier in the film, which was kind of a funny nod, because I was kind of like sitting in the theater and I was going, "Oh wow, they're actually going to get fake out. Oh, wow, that kind of sucks." But anyway, so and originally the producers thought to make a spin-off with the character of Jinx, but because the movie did so bad and Halle Berry's performance was criticized heavily, even though people didn't mind the fact that it was Halle Berry, she was coming off of Monsters Ball and off of the her portrayal as Storm in the X-Men. Her performance in this one just kind of fell flat. It felt like she was just kind of phoning it in, and so there were a lot of people, and I kind of felt that way. Like, I mean, I don't mind her character; it's not bad. Also, her little initial thing is a nod to Dr. No, the dive belt with the knife and the bikini. So yeah, there was a lot of homages. There was a lot of like really cool moments, but it relied heavily on CGI, and they kind of went a little overboard, I think, with it in terms of the technology and in terms of the different things. Now, I mentioned 007, Agent Under Fire, and 007 Nightfire. After that, after Nightfire came out, they had tried to release the GoldenEye Rogue Agent video game to try to capitalize on the popularity of the GoldenEye N64 game, and that game sold well, but a lot of people criticized it as being repetitive, which it is, and as being just kind of blah. Okay, it's just kind of a bland, repetitive shooter. So they hired let me see. I don't remember who wrote this. Was it Firestein? Does it even have it in there? I don't think it does. Doesn't say who it was written by, but basically they hired, it might have been Bruce Firestein, but they hired a guy to come in and write a continuation of the Brosnan Bond series. And that video game is everything or nothing. Using the same technology that they used on Nightfire to basically scan Pierce Brosnan's face, they used it to scan in Shannon Elizabeth, Willem Dafoe, Judi Dench, John Cleese, Maya, Richard Kiel. They got Heidi Klum in here, and this is an excellent video game, and it is a continuation of the Pierce Brosnan Bond series, and it's also a sequel. I told you we'd be getting to this. It is a sequel to this, A View to a Kill. Essentially, Willem Dafoe plays a Russian agent named Nikolai Diavolo. And Shannon Elizabeth, or is it Heidi Klum? I can't remember. One of the two plays a Russian nanobot specialist. Okay, and you find out that this Nikolai Diavolo was a protege of Max Zorin from A View to a Kill. Now, what's interesting is that Judi Dench says to Bond, he studied, this Nikolai Diavolo studied under Max Zorin, whom I believe you've met before, and he goes, yes, we once played bridge together. He lost, referring to the climax that's on the cover. Okay, so yeah, it's essentially referring to this, right? You played bridge together. Okay, and so essentially Bond has to stop these because these nanobots are trained to eat anything that's not platinum. They cannot eat platinum. They can eat any other metal on Earth. And so essentially he's going to launch all of these like rockets out, and they're going to go out to all these different places. They're going to explode. And so Bond is sent in to try to stop all of that. And there's a whole bunch of other things that go on, and Maya does the theme song, Everything or Nothing. It's an excellent video game if you've never played it, because once they did this game, that's when they realized that they could do From Russia with Love. And so these are the last two games released under the EA, when EA had the license, okay? And after this game came out, they kind of like said, let's kind of do some other things, and let's do some other things. And then they ended up losing the license to Activision. And we'll get into that when we get to the Daniel Craigs. So anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this this part of the James Bond retrospective. I know this one was long. I talked a lot about the different films because these are the ones I kind of grew up watching. This is what got me into James Bond, was the Pierce Brosnans. And then I started watching on TBS Bond Wednesdays, and then pretty soon I was like just hooked. I couldn't get enough of Bond. I started reading the books. I have the Victory Games RPG. I have a lot of the video games. I have a lot of different things. So I'm just a huge Bond fan. I love James Bond so much. Um, so stay tuned for part 6. We're going to be getting into the Daniel Craig's, and then after that I'll talk about my personal favorite Bond films, and then kind of get into the future of James Bond and where they're going with that. And so smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below. Let me know what you think of the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films. Were these some of the films you saw in the theaters like me? Were they films that you remember? Were they films that you hated? Let me know in the comments section below. And as we say, we will see you on the next one.